The morning sun cast long shadows across the granite faces of Mount Rushmore as Dr. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her hard hat and surveyed the maintenance scaffolding that now surrounded Lincoln's weathered cheek. The crisp October air carried the scent of pine and the distant rumble of machinery preparing for another day of preservation work on America's most iconic monument. Sarah had spent 3 years planning this restoration project, but nothing could have prepared her for what they were about to uncover beneath tons of carved stone. "Dr. Mitchell, we're ready for the controlled blast on the north face drainage system," called Jake Reynolds, the project's lead explosives engineer, his voice echoing off the mountainside. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision as he checked the detonation sequence one final time. Sarah nodded, feeling that familiar mixture of excitement and anxiety that came with any procedure involving explosives near such a precious national treasure. The team had discovered unstable rock formations behind Lincoln's profile during routine structural assessments. Water damage from decades of harsh South Dakota winters had created dangerous fissures that threatened the monument's integrity. The plan was simple: use carefully calculated charges to remove compromised granite and reinforce the internal structure. Sarah watched through her protective goggles as Jake's team positioned the final charges in the pre-drilled holes, each placement measured to the millimeter. "All personnel to safe distance," Jake's voice crackled through the radio. "Detonation in 60 seconds. Sarah retreated to the observation platform, her heart pounding with the weight of responsibility. One miscalculation could damage the monument irreparably, destroying a piece of American heritage that had stood for nearly a century. She thought about the countless tourists who would visit next season, expecting to see the faces of Washington, Jefferson, Roosevelt, and Lincoln, gazing eternally across the Black Hills. The explosion erupted with a controlled fury, sending a cloud of granite dust billowing across the mountainside. The sound echoed through the valleys below like thunder, followed by an eerie silence that made Sarah's ears ring. As the dust began to settle, something caught her attention through her binoculars. Where solid rock should have been exposed, there appeared to be a dark void, a hollow space that shouldn't exist according to any blueprint or geological survey. "Jake, bring your equipment up here," Sarah called, her voice tight with curiosity and concern. "Something's not right." As they approached the blast site, powerful LED lights revealed what the explosion had uncovered: a perfectly carved doorway leading into the mountain's interior, sealed for decades behind what appeared to be deliberately placed stone. The edges were too precise to be natural, too purposeful to be accidental. Sarah's hands trembled as she illuminated the hidden entrance with her flashlight. Inside, she could make out the beginning of a corridor that disappeared into darkness, its walls bearing tool marks that suggested human construction. The air that escaped from the opening carried a stale, metallic scent that made her stomach clench with unease. Whatever lay beyond that threshold had been hidden for decades, waiting in absolute darkness for someone to literally blast their way inside. "Dr. Mitchell," Jake whispered, his usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. "This isn't on any of the original construction documents. Borglum never mentioned building chambers inside the mountain." Sarah stared into the mysterious passage, realizing that their routine maintenance project had just uncovered something that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal beneath one of America's most visited monuments. Against every instinct screaming at her to wait for proper authorization, Sarah found herself stepping across the threshold into the hidden corridor. The beam of her flashlight cut through darkness that had remained undisturbed for decades, revealing walls lined with what appeared to be reinforced concrete rather than natural stone. Jake followed close behind, his own light dancing across surfaces that bore the unmistakable marks of deliberate construction from the 1940s or 1950s. The corridor stretched approximately 50 feet before opening into a larger chamber, and with each step, Sarah felt the weight of discovery pressing down on her shoulders. The air grew thicker, heavy with the musty scent of old paper and something else she couldn't identify. When they reached the chamber's entrance, both lights froze on what lay before them. Rows of metal filing cabinets, tables covered with documents, and walls lined with photographs that made Sarah's blood run cold. "Jesus Christ," Jake breathed, his voice barely a whisper in the enclosed space. The photographs showed groups of people in what appeared to be medical or scientific settings, but their faces held expressions of confusion and terror that suggested these weren't willing participants in whatever experiments were being conducted. Sarah approached one of the filing cabinets, her hands shaking as she pulled open a drawer labeled Project Mindbridge, Phase 3, 1953-1957. Inside were hundreds of files containing detailed records of psychological experiments conducted on American citizens without their consent. Test subjects ranging from military personnel to civilians had been subjected to various forms of mind control research, including drug administration, sensory deprivation, and techniques that Sarah recognized from her knowledge of the CIA's notorious MKUltra program. The documentation was meticulous, clinical, and absolutely horrifying in its matter-of-fact description of human suffering. "Sarah, you need to see this," Jake called from across the chamber, his voice tight with disbelief. He stood before a wall map of the United States, marked with red pins and connected by colored strings, creating a web that encompassed dozens of cities across the country. Each pin was labeled with dates, numbers, and brief notes that suggested a coordinated network of secret facilities conducting similar research. The scope was staggering, implicating not just isolated incidents, but a systematic program spanning multiple decades. As Sarah moved deeper into the chamber, she discovered additional rooms branching off from the main space. One contained what appeared to be monitoring equipment from the Cold War era, with banks of outdated computers and recording devices that had been used to track and analyze the results of the experiments. Another room held personal effects, jewelry, photographs, letters, items that had likely belonged to test subjects who had never returned home. The sound of approaching helicopters outside made both of them freeze. Through the chamber's ventilation system, they could hear the distinctive whop-whop of military aircraft circling the monument. Sarah felt her stomach drop as she realized that someone had been monitoring their discovery, waiting for them to uncover what had been hidden for so long. The helicopters were followed by the sound of vehicles arriving at high speed, their engines echoing off the mountainside. "Dr. Mitchell, we need to leave, now!" Jake's voice carried an urgency that made Sarah's heart race. But as they gathered armfuls of the most damning documents they could carry, the sound of footsteps in the corridor told them it was already too late. Bright tactical lights blazed through the chamber entrance, and authoritative voices demanded they step away from the files immediately. "Dr. Sarah Mitchell," came a woman's voice, calm and professional but carrying an unmistakable threat. "I'm Agent Victoria Cross with the Department of Homeland Security. You and Mr. Reynolds need to step away from those materials and exit the chamber immediately. What you've discovered here is classified at the highest levels of national security." Agent Cross stood silhouetted against the harsh tactical lights, her dark suit and professional demeanor a stark contrast to the chaotic scene of scattered documents and decades-old secrets. Sarah clutched the files tighter against her chest, her mind racing as she processed the implications of what they had discovered. The agent's arrival within hours of their discovery couldn't be coincidental. Someone had been watching, waiting for this moment. "These documents detail illegal human experimentation on American citizens," Sarah said, her voice stronger than she felt. "People have a right to know what their government did to them." Agent Cross stepped closer, her expression remaining neutral despite the gravity of the accusation. Behind her, 3 additional agents in tactical gear positioned themselves strategically around the chamber, their presence making it clear that negotiation wasn't an option. "Dr. Mitchell, what you found represents decades-old classified research conducted during a time when our nation faced existential threats," Cross replied, extending her hand expectantly. The Cold War required difficult decisions, and some operations were deemed necessary for national security. These materials could compromise ongoing intelligence operations and endanger current assets if they became public. Jake shifted nervously beside Sarah, his eyes darting between the agents and the multiple exit routes from the chamber. "Necessary?" he repeated, his voice thick with disgust. "I saw photographs of children in those files, kids who looked terrified. How is terrorizing children necessary for national security?" His words echoed off the concrete walls, emphasizing the moral weight of what lay scattered around them. Sarah opened one of the files she held, reading aloud despite the agent's obvious displeasure. Subject 247, age 16, exhibited severe psychological trauma after 14 days of sensory deprivation combined with experimental drug protocols. Subject became catatonic and was transferred to Facility B7 for permanent containment. Her voice cracked as she continued. These weren't enemy combatants or willing volunteers. These were American citizens, including children, who were kidnapped and tortured in the name of science. The chamber fell silent except for the distant hum of ventilation systems that had kept these secrets preserved for decades. Agent Cross's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing something that might have been regret or perhaps simply frustration at the complications Sarah and Jake represented. The individuals responsible for those operations were operating under emergency wartime powers, she said quietly. Most of them are dead now. Exposing these operations serves no constructive purpose and would only cause pain to surviving families. And what about justice for the victims? Sarah demanded, backing toward one of the side chambers while still clutching the files. What about accountability? How many people suffered and died for experiments that probably produced nothing useful anyway? As she spoke, she caught Jake's eye and nodded almost imperceptibly toward the monitoring room they had discovered earlier. Agent Cross sighed, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of countless similar conversations throughout her career. Dr. Mitchell, I'm going to give you one final opportunity to surrender those materials voluntarily. After that, my team will be forced to take them by other means. The choice is yours, but either way, these documents are not leaving this mountain. Sarah felt the cold concrete wall against her back and realized they were trapped between the agents and decades of buried government secrets. But as she looked at Jake's determined expression and thought about the faces in those photographs, she knew they couldn't simply walk away and pretend they had never seen the evidence of systematic government torture conducted beneath one of America's most sacred monuments. In the split second before Agent Cross could signal her team, Sarah hurled her flashlight at the chamber's main electrical panel, plunging the space into complete darkness. Jake's mining experience kicked in immediately as he grabbed Sarah's hand and pulled her toward the monitoring room, while the agents shouted commands and tactical lights swept chaotically across the chamber walls. "There's another exit through the equipment room," Jake whispered urgently as they navigated between filing cabinets in the darkness. Behind them, Agent Cross barked orders for the building to be sealed and all exits monitored. The sound of boots on concrete echoed through the hidden corridors as additional personnel flooded into the mountain's secret interior. They reached the monitoring room just as emergency lighting flickered on throughout the facility, casting eerie red shadows across decades-old equipment. Sarah stuffed as many documents as possible into her jacket, while Jake examined a ventilation grate that appeared large enough for human passage. "This connects to the main mountain drainage system," he said, prying at the metal grating with a crowbar from his tool belt. "Dr. Mitchell," came Agent Cross's voice over what appeared to be an internal communication system, "you're only making this situation more difficult for yourselves. The mountain is surrounded and you have nowhere to go. Surrender the documents and we can discuss your role in our ongoing security review." The calm, professional tone couldn't mask the underlying threat in her words. As they crawled through the narrow ventilation shaft, Sarah's mind raced with the implications of their discovery. The scope of the experiments, the systematic cover-up, the immediate response to their breakthrough. It all suggested an organization that had been operating in secret for decades, with resources and authority that reached the highest levels of government. The shaft opened into a natural cave system that Jake recognized from the mountain's geological surveys. "We can reach the tourist parking area through these caves," he said, but his relief was short-lived. Bright lights appeared behind them in the ventilation system, accompanied by voices and the sound of pursuit. As they emerged into the cave system, Sarah heard Agent Cross's voice echoing from a portable radio nearby. "Be advised, we have a potential media containment situation. Professor Henry Blackwood has been asking questions about the archaeological team's work and may have been in communication with Dr. Mitchell. I need him brought in for questioning immediately." Sarah's heart sank as she realized their elderly consultant, a respected historian who had helped them understand Mount Rushmore's construction history, was now in danger because of their discovery. The organization wasn't just trying to contain the evidence, they were systematically eliminating anyone who might have knowledge of what lay hidden beneath the monument. "Jake," she whispered as they navigated the cave passages, "they're going after Professor Blackwood. We can't let them silence everyone who knows about this." The sound of helicopters overhead grew louder, and Sarah realized that their escape from the mountain was only the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous pursuit. The cave system led them deeper into Mount Rushmore's interior than Sarah had ever imagined possible, revealing a network of tunnels that predated the monument's construction. Jake's knowledge of the mountain's geology proved invaluable as they navigated passages that seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness, always staying one step ahead of their pursuers' tactical lights. "There's a service tunnel that connects to the old construction elevator shaft," Jake whispered as they paused to catch their breath in a small chamber. "If we can reach it, we might be able to get word to Professor Blackwood before they find him." But as they prepared to move deeper into the mountain, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from multiple directions, suggesting Agent Cross had split her team to cover more ground. Sarah clutched the documents tighter, knowing they represented the only proof of decades of government crimes against American citizens. The faces from those photographs haunted her thoughts. Innocent people who had trusted their government and paid with their sanity, their freedom, and in some cases, their lives. She couldn't let their suffering be buried again beneath layers of national security classifications. A burst of gunfire echoed through the tunnels, followed by Jake's sharp cry of pain. Sarah turned to see blood spreading across his shoulder as tactical lights blazed from behind them. "Keep going," he gasped, pushing her toward the service tunnel entrance. "Get those documents out. Get the truth out." His sacrifice gave her the precious seconds she needed to disappear into the mountain's deepest passages. Agent Cross's voice echoed behind her. "Mr. Reynolds is down, but stable. Dr. Mitchell is still mobile with the classified materials." The clinical tone with which she described Jake's injury revealed everything Sarah needed to know about the organization's priorities. Human lives were acceptable casualties in their mission to protect decades-old secrets. As Sarah navigated the final passage toward the construction elevator shaft, she heard additional voices that made her heart race with recognition. Professor Blackwood was somewhere in these tunnels, and from the sound of the conversation, he wasn't there voluntarily. The elderly historian's voice carried a dignity that remained unbroken despite his circumstances as he questioned Agent Cross about the legal authority for his detention. The elevator shaft offered her only chance of escape, but as Sarah began her desperate climb toward the surface, she realized the true scope of what she was up against. The organization had resources, manpower, and decades of experience in keeping secrets buried, but they had underestimated one crucial factor: the determination of people who had seen the truth and refused to let it remain hidden in the darkness beneath America's most iconic monument. Sarah's hands were raw and bleeding by the time she reached the elevator shaft's maintenance exit, emerging behind Lincoln's carved head as dawn broke over the Black Hills. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was escaping through the monument to the president who had fought to preserve the Union. carrying evidence of how that same government had betrayed its own citizens decades later. The parking area was surrounded by federal vehicles, but Sarah's knowledge of the monument's maintenance routes allowed her to reach the visitor center unseen. Her phone had been destroyed during the chase, but she knew Professor Blackwood's contacts in the media, historians and journalists who had spent years investigating government overreach and would understand the significance of what she carried. Agent Cross appeared as Sarah reached the public phone booth, flanked by two agents with their hands positioned near their weapons. "Dr. Mitchell, this ends now," Cross said, her professional composure finally showing cracks of desperation. "Those documents represent national security information that could endanger ongoing operations and compromise the safety of current intelligence assets." "They represent proof that our government tortured children," Sarah replied, backing against the phone booth while clutching the files. "And you've already proven you'll kill to keep that secret buried." The standoff attracted attention from early morning tourists, their cameras and phones beginning to record the confrontation unfolding before the monument. Professor Blackwood's voice suddenly crackled from a portable radio one of the agents carried. The elderly historian had apparently escaped during the chaos in the tunnels and was already in contact with news organizations. The documents Dr. Mitchell carries detail systematic human experimentation conducted without consent on American citizens, including children, between 1953 and 1972. His voice echoed across the memorial grounds. Agent Cross's expression shifted to resignation as she realized the information was already beyond their control. News vans were arriving in the distance, and social media posts from tourists were beginning to spread across the internet. The decades-old secrets hidden beneath Mount Rushmore were finally seeing daylight. 6 months later, Sarah testified before a congressional committee investigating the government's secret experimentation programs. The documents she had risked everything to preserve became the foundation for a national reckoning with America's hidden past. Families of victims finally received acknowledgment of their loved ones' suffering, and new oversight mechanisms were established to prevent similar abuses. As Sarah stood before Mount Rushmore on the anniversary of their discovery, she reflected on the price of truth. Jake had recovered from his injuries and continued his work preserving America's monuments, while Professor Blackwood had become a national advocate for government transparency. The mountain still kept many secrets, but the most damaging ones now belonged to history rather than shadow.